Around, and I went backpacking at one point, and I basically disappeared for about 2.5 years. It was 2.5 years before I got back home to Australia, and it wasn't long after that that I set out on a journey, if you like, on a trip that would absolutely change the course of my life. Anybody familiar with the Great Barrier Reef, the northeastern part of Australia? Sounds like some of you have been there. I was living in a place called the Whitsunday Islands at the time, and I'd heard about this place called Hinchinbrook Island. Now, Hinchinbrook Island is an island that's about 26 miles long from north to south, and there's a trail that starts in the north, finishes in the south, that I figured I would go and hike and spend about 5 days hiking this trail. So I drive up to a small town called Cardwell, and I catch a ferry boat across. It's about a 40-minute ferry ride. We land in the northern end of the island, and we all jump off the boat. There's about 5 of us, and we sort of head off in different directions. And I start hiking south, and each little beach I come to, I stop and I have a swim. And eventually I come to a beach called Little Ramsey Bay. And on this beach, the beach is deserted apart from one guy. There's one guy and he's sitting. We'll need a bit of creative visualization here from you guys, because he's sitting at the water's edge with his legs crossed, and he's got a sketch pad and he's sketching the scene as the sun goes down behind him. And there he is, sketching away. He's got the sketch pad there, and he's sitting there, and he's wearing a red bandana. Now, I mentioned the red bandana because that's all he had on. And I remember thinking at the time, these Dutch guys, hey? That'd be right, because it turned out he introduced himself and as Geert van Koolen from the Netherlands, and it's just like, that'd be right. Talk about a pretty chilled out kind of individual. Now, we basically sat down to make a meal that night and had dinner, and Geert tells me that what he wants to do is climb to the top of Mount Bowen, the island's tallest peak. And when you look at Hinchinbrook Island from the side, it looks like a dragon's back. Right, there's a jagged mountain range, runs from the north to south, and Geert's plan was that he wanted to climb Mount Bowen, and he asked me, do you want to join me? And I said, give me 5 minutes to think about that. I only needed 5 seconds. All right, I came back and I said, let's do it. First light the next morning, we headed out to climb Mount Bowen. We made our way up a pretty rugged trail. There's no trail to the top of Mount Bowen. You make your way up a creek bed. And we'd made our way. We'd spent most of the day making our way as high as we could go. We'd eventually set up camp. Geert had just got into his sleeping bag. I was just about to get into mine. And I realised, well, hang on a minute. Before I do that, I need to use a restroom, which always sounds kind of wacko because there are no restrooms in the outdoors. I needed to take a leak. The best way for me to do that was to cross the creek and scramble up over a rock face that was about 12 foot high. And I figured that I could make my way over the top of the rock face, get away from the creek. Because any of you guys spent much time outside? Yeah? Anyone been unlucky enough and prepared to out themselves this afternoon? Anyone had giardia? Beaver fever? There's a couple of people have outed themselves there. Excellent, it's not just me. I've had it a couple of times and I wasn't in a hurry to get it again, so I wanted to get as far away from the creek as possible. So I cross the creek and I make my way over to this rock face and I find a crack. I get my hands in this crack. I get them up as high as I can. I get my right foot up against the rock wall, get my left hand up a little higher, and I pull up to start making my way over this rock face. And as I pull up, I just hear this almighty crack. Just this huge crack as a piece of the wall breaks out and absolutely slams me back down into that creek bed. I didn't fall very far, maybe 2 feet at the most. They told me afterwards that rock weighed a ton, and it just ground its way immediately, just ground its way down into my legs. I'm telling you, I have never felt anything like it. I screamed out Geert came running across to be greeted by this scene of me pinned underneath this huge rock from the waist down, and things got pretty crazy from that point on. We both started pushing at this thing. It was obvious that it wasn't going anywhere. Within a few minutes, I'd sent him off into the bush, and he came back with a branch off a tree to use as a lever. We got that under the rock. He heaved on it with all his might, and it snapped like a twig. And that's when I knew I was in trouble. That's when I knew that I wasn't going to be crawling back down the mountain over a period of however long it was going to take, 3, 4, 5 days, a week. No, that's when I knew that the only way I was coming out was for Geert to hike out and organise a rescue. So the next morning, I had absolutely the longest night of my life. The next morning, Geert packed his things. We hugged goodbye, and I watched him turn around and walk back down that creek bed, and I tell you now, I have never, ever felt so lonely, because I knew that I was going to be trapped under that rock for at least another day. Right? He had to make it back down to the beach where we'd started off. He had to make his way back along the coast to where the ferry comes in once a day. I'm telling you, as he walked away, I knew that I was staring down the barrel of my ultimate test. I ended up spending 2 days underneath that rock before I got to hear what is still my favourite sound.
We got the call late afternoon that there was a hiker trapped under a large boulder out on Hinchinbrook Island. So we went out in the helicopter and winched down on the wire cable with our equipment, and indeed found this fellow who was in trouble. I didn't think he was alive, and I was given to understand he'd been there for 2 days. And I think once he realized we were there, he roused, and really he put forth a heroic effort to get himself out of there with our help.
Excellent. We'll get rid of that before the violins kick in, hey? So, a helicopter comes in, takes me straight to hospital. They start running all kinds of tests on my legs, and eventually I have a guy, surgeon, come and introduce himself as Dr. Bill Clark. Still probably the most softly spoken man I think I've ever had a conversation with. And he says, "Warren, you realise your legs have been pretty badly damaged?" And I said, "Oh yeah." Yep. I could actually see my right foot the way I was trapped, and it didn't look good, but I'd sort of pushed that out of my mind. He says, "I hate to be the one to have to tell you this, but we're going to have to amputate them." And it was that one word, "them," that just ripped something out of my guts. It had crossed my mind that I might lose that right foot, but the idea of losing both legs just absolutely came from left field and ripped something out of me, and all I could muster, and the best I would do, was, "How high are we talking here?" And he says, "Above the knees." At that point, I just pretty much cried myself to sleep and woke up the following afternoon to pretty much a whole new world, to a whole new reality. All right, here's a guy, I spent my whole life pushing my comfort zone out, and I wake up, you guys have seen it, I wake up with tubes hanging out of me everywhere. I feel like I've been hit by a truck. I'm missing both legs. I wake up with a tube down my throat. I can't even breathe. Boy, talk about intense.